They are some of the world's most notorious serial killers.
He was like a god when he had a corpse as his plaything.
But were these psychopaths born evil, or did their mothers make them into monsters?
A mother may actually dote on a child too much.
I'm Donald McIntyre, and I'm on a quest to explore how some of history's most horrific murderers were molded by their dysfunctional relationships with their mothers.
When it comes to people who are pathological, psychopathic, the influence of the mother is absolutely dominant.
I'll be piecing together events in their childhoods and talking to criminologists and psychologists to try to understand what motivated their monstrous crimes.
We never come across a serial killer who'd killed that many people.
In this program, Harold Shipman, the Angel of Death, a doctor who murdered more than 200 of his patients with overdoses of morphine.
You injected a fatal overdose? No.
Did his mother's controlling behavior and her untimely death help turn him into one of the world's most prolific serial killers?
Perhaps he was killing his mother over and over and over again.
This big three-letter word comes up, why? Why did he do this?
Some serial killers become notorious because of the sheer depravity of their crimes. Others make the headlines because of the enormous death toll they leave behind. Dr. Harold Shipman was one of those. On the 7th of September 1998, the police arrested Shipman on the suspicion of killing 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy. He had murdered Mrs. Grundy in her own home with a lethal injection of diamorphine. The method that would become his signature.
The classic Shipman death is that they're found sitting on the sofa, a cold cup of tea next to them, their sleeve rolled up, and they've died on the point of the needle of morphine.
The first murder charge opened the floodgates on decades of suspicion surrounding Dr. Shipman's behavior. A full-scale inquiry into Shipman's medical career was then launched. The police investigation would reveal a growing list of potential victims. The bodies of 8 more elderly women were excavated from their graves between September and December 1998. Shipman was charged and convicted of 15 murders, but this was just the tip of the iceberg.
Officially, Shipman is believed to have carried out 215 murders, but there are 45 other suspicious deaths over a period of 23 years.
Most shockingly of all, every one of his victims had voluntarily placed their lives into his hands. Everyone he killed was a patient, and he callously broke that trusted bond between patient and doctor.
The fact that this man who's purporting to offer you comfort and solace, compassion, cure your ills, is actually determined to kill you is very, very unsettling.
Over decades of murder, Shipman wielded the power of life and death over his patients.
At each killing, he felt more and more godlike, more and more in control.
Dr. Harold Shipman is the world's most prolific serial killer. But was it the relationship he had with his mother that sowed the seeds for murder? To find out if Shipman's upbringing helped turn him into a murderer, we need to spool back the years to just after World War II and his working-class roots here in Nottingham.
Shipman lived in what we always call Bestwood Estate, which was a new council development, a very big one, which lots and lots of people who had lived in rather poor housing in the city had then moved out into what to them would have been a nice new home, possibly even with an inside toilet and a bathroom.
His family were particularly keen that he was not a council estate boy. His mother had high aspirations for her children. They were going to be a little bit above the other children in the area. The idea in those days was you were allowed to play outside. There were no cars around, there was no worries. The Shipman children didn't play with the other children on the estate. Their mother made sure that they certainly didn't play with any of the ones she regarded as rough children.
This is the street where the young Shipman grew up. His family were part of this tough working-class community. But were there any clues in his childhood that could point to the mass murderer he was to become?
Shipman was somebody who started from moderate, humble beginnings. He didn't have a massive advantage in life. His only advantage was the fact that his mother thought that he was way above his actual station in life.
A childhood in which he was made to feel very strongly that he was different from the others in the area and rather better than they were. He had an older sister and a younger brother, but he was the clever boy. He was the boy that she pinned all her hopes and aspirations on.
Shipman took this on board, even as a child. He went out thinking that he was better than others and had a kind of social distance between himself and others. This seemed to be partly inherent and very much reinforced by his mother.
Vera even went to the extent of dressing Harold differently to other children to set him apart.
There's a picture of him with his classmates, and Harold is the only one wearing a bow tie because Vera liked to present him very smartly.
Neighbours commented about how well-dressed, well-brought up and well-mannered they were, and that was very important to her.
But what would turn this well-mannered and well-dressed boy into a monster?
He had, by all accounts, a relatively normal childhood, but there was something in the way that Vera set him apart from almost everyone else that could have given him a superiority complex, and certainly in later life gave him to believe that he could exercise the power over life and death.
To get the essence, to understand Harold, you really have got to understand Vera. So what deficits were in her life that she felt she had to propel all her ambition or lost kind of opportunities onto Harold?
Well, Vera was illegitimate, so she was born out of wedlock, and at the time that carried a massive stigma. So all the way through her life, she had this label which was attached to her and suffered because of it. And I think she didn't want that for her own children, and she saw opportunities for Harold that just weren't there for her.
Within the working class community, it seems she labelled him, as much as she was labelled as an illegitimate, she labelled him as the chosen one very early on, even dressing him up in a working class estate as a kid with a bow tie. I mean, if there's anything that's going to separate him and create some degree of isolation.
And I think it's at a time before he even realises those differences between him and his peers. So often when children become conscious of this type of thing, it's much later on. But for him, this was something that was marked very, very early on. Harold was very much targeted. He was singled out as the individual within this family that was going to be somebody, going to make something of his life.
Well, you might call it a kind of influence, encouragement, ambition, but in essence what's at play here is abuse. It's projection of the mother's ambition upon her son.
Very much from the outset of his life, what he got from his mother was the message that actually we're not good enough as we are, you're not good enough as you are. And there's the desire to want to be middle class, so to be happy, to actually realise our ambitions. You need to act, you need to do something. So that's an enormous amount of pressure to be on a pair of very young shoulders.
And this is the beginning of a kind of God complex, a sense that he is better and he can exert control, but it wasn't sufficient to turn him into a serial killer.
All of us do experience this. Our parents want us to do well, they want us to do better than they did, and they try and create opportunities for us. But Vera took this to a whole new level. So there's immense pressure there, but I don't think that is sufficient to explain what he would later go on to become.
Coming up, tragedy in the family. Did his mother's death set the template for almost all of his murders?
Perhaps he was killing his mother over and over and over again throughout his life.
Harold Shipman was born on a council estate in Nottingham and his mother doted on him. She had high ambitions and hopes that he would do well in life and escape his working class background. Apart from a pushy mother, though, there's no clear evidence of any childhood trauma that we would normally associate with a mass murderer. So what turned Harold Shipman into one of the world's most prolific serial killers? One way to escape the poverty of post-war Nottingham was through education. And it was Vera, Harold's mother's greatest ambition, to see her son, age 11, pass the entrance exam to the local grammar school.
The Shipmans, as a family, I am sure, would have been delighted by his success at 11+ and going to grammar school.
On a council estate where only 2 or 3 boys went to the grammar school in their neat uniforms, he was something very special indeed. And she made him feel that.
High Pavement Grammar School was considered by the majority of people in the city of Nottingham to be the leading boys' grammar school.
He was clever. That was very, very important to Vera. And she thought that he was absolutely a miracle child, and she entered all her ambitions and her hopes on him. He was not going to grow up and live in a council house.
Here on the site of his former grammar school, Harold was not quite the shining academic star his mother wanted him to be. For him, it was a hard slog all the way.
It's an experience I think a lot of children have, that they're very bright at junior school with a group of other children from their neighbourhood, and then they go to grammar school and hang on, there's a lot of other very bright children.
When he struggled, he had to retake exams. He was not as academically bright as his mother had led him to believe.
He worked very, very hard to keep up. He learnt from his mother the need to keep up.
Harold, along with the rest of us, would have felt this rather weighty responsibility that you were now at the grammar school. You were the lucky ones who passed the 11+ and were capable of going on to do some very interesting things. Get a better job, become someone important.
He was not as bright as he thought he was himself, but he was determined to overcome this factor, and perhaps some of that aggression began to spill out onto the sports field.
And Harold's sport of choice was rugby.
Shipman had the reputation of being a very fierce tackler.
The only time he ever showed any emotion and any force of personality was that he was a very aggressive rugby player.
Tackling people at top speed, guys much bigger than himself. Shipman's presence on a rugby field was twice as big as his presence around school.
This was a safe environment to let go of his emotions. You're allowed to be ferocious on a rugby pitch, whereas the rest of his time he was bottling that up.
By the time he reached 6th form, a rather isolated Harold Shipman, under the strict guidance of his mother, continued to work hard.
The one thing people remember is him going to and from school with a rucksack full of books. When everybody else was trying to avoid doing homework, he was doing more and more.
He didn't have, I believe, a lot of time for socialising.
His sense of narcissism was being encouraged by his mother, and it enabled him to focus on the serious things in life and not have to worry about having social relations.
He was not one of the naughty boys. He was never in trouble. He was trying always to fit in and do the right thing.
He didn't really have the outlets that normal children have. He didn't have his buddies, his mates to have jokes with. His conversations with any of his peers were completely serious and work-orientated.
He sometimes, I believe, thought we were immature. And I remember one occasion when I was in the company of a group of boys and someone was telling a rude joke, which, when we came to the punchline, we all guffawed and sniggered with suitable volume and approval. But as I sort of turned 180 degrees, there, sitting on the changing room bench, was Shipman. And he looked at me in a way that said, don't worry, you will grow up later.
Having sown the seeds of a superiority complex, I think that the ages between 11 and 17 proved crucial to opening up the possibility that he may become the murderer that he was to become.
I think his self-esteem was greatly boosted by getting into grammar school. This was a very, very big deal, taking the 11 plus, determine what path your life would then go on to take. So 2 of his siblings didn't get in and went to secondary modern. But Harold got into grammar school, and this would be a huge achievement for his mother. And it was something that would, again, mark him out as different from his peers and is validation, in a way, of some of the things that Vera's saying to him.
He was struggling. He wasn't quite the super student mother wanted him to be. So internally he felt a slight inferiority complex, and at the same time he had this growing sense of grandiosity, superiority, and they're quite 2 unusual, conflicting narratives.
And I think Harold had to work very, very hard whilst he was at grammar school to make sure that he maintained the same standards that his peers were maintaining. And I think that served to isolate him from them a little bit further as well, because whilst they were out getting involved in typical teenage behaviour, Harold was at home slaving away over his books. So he's isolated again from his peers at grammar school, and also even further isolated from those working class roots where he started.
1963, Shipman's strangely controlled family life is shattered when tragedy strikes. His beloved mother, Vera, is diagnosed with cancer, and at just 17, Harold becomes her primary carer as her health deteriorates.
As she was dying of lung cancer, he was the one that came home from school every day to brighten her day, which had been spent just in great pain. The doctor was very attentive and came every day and injected her with morphine, which was the one relief she had. But nonetheless, it was a very slow, painful decline.
Harold was the model of a devoted son, but there was something he witnessed here at home during his mother's painful illness that was to leave a lasting and possibly deadly impression.
He would watch repeatedly as the doctor would give her morphine and look at the relief on her face as the morphine was administered.
She would be in considerable pain, and then the doctor would come, the injection would be given, and relief would visibly flow through her body as the morphine hit.
He would have seen these people, the nurse that attended and the doctor, as being people who could do good things.
Was what young Shipman witnessed on a day-to-day basis the inspiration for his clinical approach to murder?
This is where morphine enters his life and becomes a thread that runs right through his life. And also the idea that he might want to be a doctor enters his life, because the most important thing was the daily visit from the doctor who injected her with morphine.
On the 21st of June, 1963, Harold Shipman witnessed firsthand the doctor administer Vera's last dose of morphine before she finally passed away.
We were not directly aware of how poorly Harold Shipman's mother had been.
You have to remember that cancer was not a word that was bandied around or talked about. You didn't tell the neighbours. It was almost like something shameful.
It came as an enormous shock when he told a fellow pupil, Michael Heath, on a Monday morning on their walking to school together, that his mother had died. Michael was terribly embarrassed because he didn't know how to respond, and simply spluttered something along the lines of, "Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear about that." And then that was sort of tucked away and not raised again.
Apart from the fact that he wore a black armband on the day of the funeral over his school blazer, there was no mention of it at all. Any feelings he had, and I think they were profound, but they were completely bottled up.
I don't think I can remember anyone saying to Shipman anything about the passing of his mum.
It's very tempting to see the manner of his mother's death as the model for his own killing spree, but it's likely to be much more complex than that. His immediate reaction, though, to his mother's passing is very telling and is likely to shed some light on the making of this murderer.
On the night that his mother died, Harold Shipman ran. All in all, 10, 12 miles minimum.
He couldn't sleep that night and he went out and ran and ran and ran.
He ran through the rain in the hours of darkness.
The endorphins he would have generated when running would have fueled a sense of reward in Shipman. The idea that he was relieved of his duties for his mother would have combined with the grief and that vision of the angel of mercy of the GP sitting over his mother, presiding on her death. This would have had a profound impact on him.
His mother's death and his reaction to it is absolutely critical to the development of his young mind. But what aspect of his mother's demise led him to kill at least 215 people?
He's coming across death and he's exposed to death in a very graphic way very early on in his life. So he sees his mother declining, but more importantly for me, he sees the doctor, this all-powerful figure, coming into the home, relieving his mother's suffering, and he's also becoming aware of the effects of that drug morphine that's to become such an important part of what's later to come. And this is really interesting for me because when we look at serial killers, often there is in the background somewhere parental substance misuse. So children are being introduced to substances by their parents in a very direct way. They're observing them getting high or getting drunk. And there's something similar going on here. Harold's mother has introduced him to a substance, but in an indirect way. So he's become aware of the power of morphine. This happened at such a significant stage in his development. This is the time at which you are so susceptible to outside influences, to what you see going on around you.
So with his mother's death, with her treatment with morphine, and seeing morphine as a relief and a painkiller, I mean, to my mind, this is the key pivotal moment where he sees the power of one drug over someone's life and existence, and perhaps sees some relief that his mother has passed away.
I think if you look at his immediate reaction to his mother's death, it was quite odd. He was internalising that trauma. It wasn't acceptable to talk about your feelings as a man at this time. And I think when we look at how people cope with trauma in the long term, it's suppressing those feelings and self-medicating in the way that he did in the immediate aftermath. That wasn't sufficient to deal with that trauma, and it comes out later on.
The images around his mother, her death, morphine, the role of the doctor, were never to escape him.
This figure came into the house, this GP, this all-powerful person who was able to take away his mother's pain. But also, we've got to think about the position of doctors in society. Doctors are highly respected, and the doctor coming to visit was a very big deal for people in these communities. So I think it wasn't just what the doctor was doing when he was there, but what that doctor represented, this middle-class role model, somebody who he might go on to aspire to become.
Coming up, drug addiction and Shipman's killing spree begins.
He was very cold about the fact she passed away right there in front of him and just said, "This lady's gone."
Dr. Harold Shipman is Britain's most notorious serial killer, with a tally of at least 215 victims over what's believed to be a 23-year period. Some claim that the impetus for his killing spree came from the extreme trauma of him losing his mother to cancer at the age of just 17.
She made it plain that she totally adored him, and she died before he ever could challenge that view. Most of us reach a point where we suddenly think, oh, perhaps our parents do have feet of clay and they're not always right and they're not always perfect. But she removed herself from that equation by dying.
With Vera gone, the young Shipman would now have to make his own decisions. He hatches a plan to become a doctor.
During that period, of his mother's illness. I think he saw the doctor come and alleviate his mother's pain. He saw how much his mother thought of him. He saw how much society thought of doctors, and that appealed to Shipman.
It was a case of seeing, feeling the power of the GP. He wanted that kind of control. He wanted that kind of godlike status of being able to administer life and death, to be able to preside, to, if you like, think of himself in a very grandiose and narcissistic light, to be the angel of mercy.
In order to be accepted into medical school, Shipman would need to ace his A-levels.
Getting into medical school is very difficult. The demands are high, and the first time he took his A-levels, he didn't get good enough grades. But that would have put a lot of people off. They'd have gone and done a different course at university. But he was determined, very determined.
After a lot of hard work, Harold Shipman passed his A-levels and gained a place at Leeds Medical School. Here, the work ethic that Vera instilled into her son would give him the edge over fellow students.
The very fact that he had gone through the sixth form, he had to retake his A-levels, and he had had to work very, very hard to get those grades, meant that he was in the habit of working very, very hard. So when they all had to work very hard, other people fell by the wayside. Probably brighter, cleverer people than him fell by the wayside.
Harold spent his days with his head in his books, but he did find enough time to meet his future wife. A farmer's daughter, Primrose Oxtoby.
Within the first year of him being in Leeds, he's met Primrose on the bus, and there is a kinship. They're both outsiders, they're both very vulnerable, and then bingo, she's pregnant, and everything has to change, and there's a very hasty, arranged marriage.
Shipman knew that his mother would certainly not have approved of an illegitimate child, so a shotgun wedding was the only option.
No celebration, nothing. Just let's tidy up this mess you're in.
Shipman is now a father and a husband, but he retains a clear focus on his studies and in 1970 graduates from Leeds Medical School. Now qualified, he gets his first job as a junior houseman at Pontefract Hospital in West Yorkshire. Was it here that Shipman started his reign of murder?
During his early years at this hospital, investigators have proven that Shipman was 30 times more likely to be with the patient alone at the time of death than any other doctor. It's not conclusive, but it's definitely suspicious.
One of the nurses remembers terrible night shifts when Shipman was on duty, where the death rate seemed very high. And in one night, there were 3 deaths in one shift between 6 p.m. and midnight.
What's extraordinary about Pontefract is that he, above any other doctor in that hospital, seems to be always alone with somebody as they die. Is this where it starts?
He's still suffering the effects of losing his mother at a young age, and he's gone through a phase of kind of internalising that pain and that suffering. But perhaps now is the time when he externalises it, when he starts harming other people. And because he had so little control over his childhood, he's looking for opportunities now in his early adulthood to wrestle back some of that control.
If the concerns surrounding Shipman at Pontefract had been acted upon, his career as a murderer could have stopped there. But no one spoke out.
Shipman left Pontefract Hospital in 1973 and sought work here in the nearby Yorkshire town of Todmorden.
By this time, Harold Shipman had developed a secret addiction to a morphine-based drug called pethidine.
Pethidine is a painkiller. If you use it when you're not in pain, it makes you feel extremely high. He was prescribing pethidine to patients who didn't need it, or extra pethidine to those who did need it, and stockpiling it and using it.
As his addiction grew worse, Shipman found it harder to keep it secret.
Shipman was a very heavy user of pethidine. He was blacking out, and he was found to have collapsed veins in his arms and legs, which is what a seriously addicted junkie would have.
Eventually, he was confronted by colleagues.
He asked for a second chance, and they said, no, you've got to go. And he flew into a rage. There was no shame, there was no remorse, He just wanted a second chance, and when they didn't give it him, he was furious.
The police charged him and brought him to court. He was fined £600 on fraud and forgery charges.
This could have been the end of the line for Shipman as a doctor and as a killer. But crucially, he did not lose his license to practice.
He was very lucky to be allowed to continue. I don't think he would have been allowed to continue today. I think that possibly would have been enough to have him struck off forever.
Was his drug addiction an early sign of the deadly road ahead?
It's not likely that Shipman's killings emanated from his drug addiction. I think that it's more probable the case that his drug addiction was just one symptom of this motivation to gain control over the world and to feel that kind of godlike status that he did during the killings.
Shipman's desire for control was clearly evident in the case of 67-year-old cancer patient Ava Lyons.
She'd had radiotherapy, she'd taken part in drug trials, and her hair had grown back, and her family had hoped she'd have a few more months, possibly even a year, still ahead of her. Shipman came to see her when she was in bed, and he murdered her with a shot of diamorphine.
Ava Lyons' death in March 1975 would later be confirmed as the earliest of Shipman's murders to be proved beyond doubt.
Her daughter said years later he was very cold about the fact she passed away right there in front of him, and just said, "This lady's gone."
Why did Harold Shipman choose Ava Lyons as his victim?
I think it's easier to kill somebody if you think they are going to die eventually, and you are going to ease their passage maybe by a few months, and why not?
Ava Lyons would set the pattern for his future murders. He was now well on the way to becoming a serial killer. With his addiction to pethidine, was it possible that he'd become addicted to murder? He's become the GP, that all-powerful force, and this is the ultimate realization of all his mother's ambitions, and so this gives him a more complete sense of superiority. And here he is with control over life and death with morphine, and then he develops his own addiction problems himself.
If we think about his addiction to a substance, it's an attempt to gain control. He's probably at a point where he's taking this just to feel normal, and it's not really having a psychopharmacological effect on his state of mind. He's just taking it to numb his own feelings of pain and trauma.
The police arrest him and charge him. How much did that dent his respect? What impact did that have on him?
I think he's got a label now as an addict, and that's the label that his colleagues are going to be aware of, because he's going to have to disclose this addiction, this problem, when he comes to secure employment in the future. So I think it is quite a big chink in his armour, but it's not one that holds him back. He doesn't step away from medicine at this point. He's still very determined to be a doctor and to carry on along this path.
I get the fact that he witnessed his mother's passing with the use of morphine. I'm still struck by the sense of mercy killings and euthanasia, and I'm wondering when in his murdering career did he stop sending people who had terminal illnesses to an early grave and actually started sending people who actually were not ill at all?
I mean, for me, I really don't think it was ever about euthanasia or easing other people's suffering. The only person's suffering he wanted to ease was his own.
Coming up, Shipman perfects his method of murder on the way to becoming one of the world's most prolific serial killers.
He was beginning to feel like he could do no wrong, and that his narcissistic view of himself meant that nobody would ever catch me.
By 1975, Shipman was already a drug addict and a murderer. He was also a qualified practicing doctor. It would be almost 25 years before he'd be caught, but in that time, over 200 people would die as a result of his murderous medical ministrations. But how did he get away with it for so long? And why did he kill so many people?
In 1979, Shipman moved to Hyde in the Greater Manchester area to join the Donnybrook Medical Centre as a GP.
Little did his colleagues realise, but they now had a murdering doctor at the heart of the community, and soon he would kill.
Tragically, Shipman proved immediately popular with the most vulnerable group of patients.
He attracted old ladies to him. They loved him as a doctor, so amongst his clientele, you know, the old ladies would say, oh, I want to see Dr. Shipman, and not one of the others.
Little did they know that their doctor might be their executioner. Shipman developed his own unique killing pattern. He was able to murder in plain sight. As a doctor, he could make an unannounced house call, execute the patient, and then certify the death as through natural causes. Additionally, he could push the family to cremate the body, destroying all the evidence. This was a man in complete control of the crime scene.
The classic Shipman death is that they're found sitting on the sofa, a cold cup of tea next to them, their sleeve rolled up, and they've died on the point of the needle of morphine.
But as Shipman's death toll increased, his superiority complex instilled by his mother started to create problems with his colleagues at the surgery.
He would actually get into arguments with people that were his peers and try and defeat them intellectually, but he had very little social awareness of what effect this would have with his relations with other people.
He was quite arrogant and high-handed with people he thought he could be that way with, that he would get away with it. So he would fly into a rage with the receptionists if they so much as forgot his coffee.
His inability to get on with his colleagues came to a head in 1992. Shipman's pompous behaviour resulted in him leaving the Donnybrook surgery to set up on his own.
It was only when Shipman started his own practice here on the High Street of Hyde that he felt he could act with real impunity. He was the only GP and could exert near complete control over staff and patients. He really charmed the local population, and many patients left other surgeries to join his practice.
By being a single-handed practitioner, he set himself up to be even more grandiose, to be even more in control.
The level of killings accelerated. This is probably because he was not being checked up on so regularly. He did not feel exposed to other people accessing his stats and his patient records.
Under the ideal cover and autonomy of his own practice, Shipman was now free to select victims as and when he pleased.
Shipman's killing method was almost perfect. He was dealing with people that wouldn't be missed, that would be expected to die. He was carrying this out as a GP, as a squeaky clean cover.
Shipman's modus operandi was now firmly established and bore a striking resemblance to the death of his mother, Vera.
His mother's death did form the template for most of the murders. The actual scenario of the GP at his mother's side was more or less exactly how Shipman positioned himself in each of the murders that he carried out.
And morphine is part of the whole Shipman relationship with death. He can't use another drug. It has to be morphine.
I think Shipman probably had a glimmer of his mother's image almost every time he killed one of his patients.
But for how long could he get away with murder?
As Shipman's confidence grew, and he became somewhat addicted to this process, at each killing he felt more and more godlike, more and more in control. He began to feel that he was more and more important. The recognition that he hadn't received for his standing in the community, he was feeling in these scenarios, and he would get more and more ambitious. It became somewhat irrelevant as to whether that person was close to death or not.
They said, oh, he's a good doctor, but you don't last. Lots of old ladies have died with him. So there were rumours swirling around the community at the time that something was amiss.
When Shipman accelerated his killing, he was kind of exposing himself to a risk. The risk was that statistics would catch him out, that somebody would notice too many people had died on his patch. He was becoming more and more reckless.
And it was Shipman's audacity that would lead to his arrest. On the 24th of June 1998, he would make a house visit to his final victim.
What's curious about Shipman's last murder was that it broke with his established pattern. The victim, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, was fit and wealthy and dropped dead after he'd made a house call to give her a blood test. He, of course, had given her a lethal dose of morphine.
Shipman did something that he had never done before. He created a forged will that stated that he, Dr. Harold Shipman, was the sole beneficiary of Mrs. Grundy's entire estate, valued at £350,000.
It was a very crude forgery. It was bound to be found out. He knew perfectly well that Mrs. Grundy's daughter was a lawyer, that her husband was a professor. He was not dealing with ignorant people. He sent a very crude letter to a firm of solicitors, and as soon as he'd done that, he didn't give time for the dust to settle, he killed her.
But why had Shipman become so brazen?
It could be said of many serial killers that they actually become very reckless because they kind of want to be caught. They're carrying out this brilliant plan that they have, and nobody's recognising it. So in a way, they kind of half want that recognition and want to be caught.
If you are the greatest serial killer in the world, what's the point of people not knowing that?
Finally, Mrs. Grundy's daughter's suspicions resulted in the exhumation of her body on the 1st of August 1998. Tests revealed the cause of death as a massive overdose of morphine.
If you wanted to kill and avoid suspicion, you would not use morphine. Morphine has been found in the body of mummies 1,000 years old. It doesn't disappear.
I suggest to you that you have injected Mrs. Grundy with a fatal overdose of morphine that brought about her death. No.
On the 7th of September, Dr. Harold Shipman was charged with Kathleen Grundy's murder. Suspicions were voiced across the community, spanning the decades. How long had Harold Shipman been a killer?
There is a taxi driver in Hyde who blames himself that he didn't raise the alarm because he was saying to his wife, another Shipman killing, and she would write it down. And as soon as the can of worms opened, he went to see the policeman and he said, oh, I can tell you all these names.
With accusations flooding in, the authorities started to exhume bodies.
The police spent months excavating plots in graveyards in the area, and gradually the scale of his crimes became clear.
On the 31st of January 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted at Preston Crown Court on 15 counts of murder. The inquiry that followed concluded that Shipman was responsible for killing 215 of his former patients. It's suspected that he may have killed many more.
As one of the doctors who was in practice with him said, I didn't like him, I found him obnoxious, I found him a very difficult person to get on with. But did I think he was killing people? No, I did not.
As much as any other serial killer or murder we've studied, in this case, the mother definitely made the murderer.
I think, yeah, this is very much a case of nurture that's going on here. Out of a real concern for her son not to experience the kind of exclusion that she has. She's gone way too far the other way and made him, you know, the extreme end of the spectrum.
He is one of the most enigmatic serial killers the world has ever seen. He's methodical, he's dispassionate, he's cold, he's never spoken about his crimes. Right across his career, you know, there are red flags. He's strange, his behaviour is odd, it's different. He's just so unlike any other serial killer.
People have a lot of trouble making sense of Harold Shipman, particularly criminologists, because he is so unusual. So often when we look at serial killers, they've come from very violent, very physically abusive families, but that doesn't seem to have been the case with Harold Shipman. What was going on here in this family between Harold and his mum was psychological violence, essentially.
So he was living in his own mother's social construct in his own head. So from a very early stage, he was isolated, and that was preserved right the way.
There was a kind of lack of checks and balances on his behaviour throughout his life because of this kind of social isolation that was going on. But he's very interesting because he manages to kind of maintain just enough social engagement with people to pass for normal. Underlying all of it is this need for power, this need for control. He had very little control over what went on in his childhood. So he searches out opportunities to control other people in his adult life, and that rapidly becomes killing other people.
He's addicted to it. This is an addictive personality, and that's why we've seen the numbers we've seen.
I think it's almost kind of scientific. Here's a doctor who's trained in medical school, this repetition of this same act time and time and time again.
Now, he's unique. He's a doctor from a council estate, driven mother. She was illegitimate. I mean, all the ingredients that went to create Britain's most prolific serial killer. Will we ever see his like again?
I sincerely hope not. I think a lot of these things came together and created a toxic mix that we're only going to see once.
I wish I could be so sure. Most serial killers prey on the vulnerable. Those on the margins of society could disappear without anyone ever noticing. But Shipman's serial killing was of an altogether different caliber. As their doctor, his victims trusted him with their lives. And he betrayed that trust by taking away their very last breaths, endlessly replaying and repeating the trauma of his own mother's death when he was just 17 years of age.
While serving a life sentence, Shipman hanged himself on August the 25th, 2005. He never once spoke about his crimes.
Their last words were probably, "Thank you, doctor," which would have pleased him no end.